Clarke, in some of our earlier segments, I've let you get by with mentioning case law, and I haven't pinned you down on it because I'm thinking, number one, if I'm pulled over for DWI, I'm already panicked. I'm not thinking about case law. I don't know what case law is. Number two, if I'm not a lawyer, I don't know what case law is. What do you mean when you're talking about case law, and how does that apply to DWI?
Well, Jim, case law are cases that have been decided by the Court of Appeals that deal specifically with a fact pattern in front of the court. In other words, it's one thing to lay out in a statute what a DWI is. Well, if it's driving and you're impaired and it's on a public street or highway, but what do those terms mean? What is a public street or highway? What is driving? Operation of a vehicle versus driving a vehicle down the road. So we lawyers like to get into these very detailed situations and say the law doesn't apply or does apply in this individual case.
People that have had similar circumstances to the one I've just been pulled over, and you're searching through these volumes of case law to see which one is appropriate, right?
You search through thousands of cases, but after you've been doing it for a while, in DWI law, there's a couple hundred cases that we need to know on the top of our head to be prepared to fight individual issues that come up regularly in DWIs.
Okay, I understand, but now can you talk about specific cases that might make some sense here?
Yes, there are several right off the top of my head. State versus Watkins was a case in which a man was pulled over and eventually charged with DWI, but he was only weaving within his lane. And the court eventually ruled that it was a legal stop, but the court said that you had to have 15 seconds of continuous weaving before you could justify blue lights going on.
Right.
So the court basically said if you don't have 15 seconds of continuous weaving, you don't have a legal stop. So we may be able to get a case thrown out of court based on the stop. Another example is State versus Myers. Gurney Myers was pulled over, and they were off at the Rockingham races, I think, and he was out of town, and the officer arrested him and took him downtown. Well, his wife was in the car with him, and she said, "Can I come downtown with him? We're from out of town." And the officer said, "Ma'am, you've been drinking. I don't think that'd be a good idea." So she went on home with the other person that was in the car. When Mr. Myers got downtown, he's given his breathalyzer rights. He said, "You have a right to have a witness come witness this testing procedure." And he said, "Well, my wife was here, but you sent her home."
Right.
And the Court of Appeals threw out the breath test and said, well, they can't use that now because he was denied access to the witness of his choosing.
Amazing.
So very specific fact-oriented situations. Right now, I've got a case before the Court of Appeals, State versus Vesey. Legal cases take a long time sometimes. The State versus Vesey, the Court of Appeals has already ruled that North Carolina license checks that search to enforce all the North Carolina motor vehicle statutes may not be constitutional. I don't know if you can get this graphic or not, but I was on the cover of Lawyers Weekly just last year.
That's right.
With the Vesey case. I argued it. I was very honored to argue it at the Wake Forest School of Law. They had a special setting of the Court of Appeals, and we have re-argued the Vesey case for the second time, and we're waiting currently for a decision to come out of the Court of Appeals. But the question will be, are license checks statewide even legal? And I might be able to get that entire process thrown out of court as being an illegal procedure.
Thanks, Clarke. That's amazing. So much to consider, and especially when we're talking about case law and applying case law. Another good reason why you need Clarke on your side and not try to represent yourself in DWI cases. Well, speaking of that, we're going to talk about organizing the case, and that's coming up next. Clarke, in previous segments, we've talked about amendments, we've talked about case law. How in the world do you plan to organize a case around all these things?
Well, that's a good question. It's real important when you start looking at a defense to a driving while impaired case that you get it organized, because it can go many different directions and there are literally hundreds of different technicalities. So if you will, if you're watching this video, sit down and take notes during this. There are going to be four basic areas that we talk about defending the case. One is the stop, how you were stopped. Did blue lights go on? Was it a wreck case and the police came to the scene? Was it a checkpoint where you were detained on the side of the road with no reason whatsoever? So, but the stop is sort of category number one.
And we'll go into each of these specifically
yes.
later on. We're just going to preview these. All right.
Category number two, the arrest. After you've been stopped briefly, the police are doing an investigation. Typically it's the finger to nose things, but they do a field sobriety test and then they make a decision to arrest you. Well, when you've been arrested, that raises a higher level of seizure, and there's a Fourth Amendment issue, and so we're going to talk about the arrest as a very specific probable cause issue. The third area is the chemical testing, whether it be a breath test, a blood test, DREs, or what we call drug recognition experts, or a refusal. We're going to talk about what happens with the chemical testing procedures and were all of the statutory requirements followed correctly. And then the fourth area that we talk about is what I call the other category, which is the Fifth Amendment rights, the Sixth Amendment rights, post-trial motions to get the case dismissed, but sort of a general other category. But if we talk about those four areas, we can keep the case better organized.
Thanks, Clarke. And as promised, coming up in the next segment, we'll start going in depth on each of those issues, beginning with the stop.